The Cold War is remembered as the conflict that never happened. Textbooks call it a standoff. Documentaries frame it as ideological tension. The narrative suggests two superpowers circled each other for decades, then walked away when the Soviet Union collapsed. What remains unexamined is the infrastructure built to continue fighting after the people who authorized it were gone. These were not contingency plans. They were autonomous systems designed to survive the end of command structures, the destruction of cities, and the absence of human decision-making. They were built to operate in a world where no one was left to give orders. 20 of these systems were developed, deployed, and in some cases activated during events the public was never told had occurred. Some were decommissioned, others were classified in ways that ensure their current status remains unknown. What follows is not speculative. It is reconstructed from declassified documents, congressional testimonies sealed for decades, and technical manuals that were never meant to be read outside secure facilities. In 1958, the United States Air Force began development of a communication system that would function after a nuclear first strike eliminated all ground-based command centers. The project was called the Airborne Command Post, later designated Looking Glass. The concept was simple. A modified Boeing aircraft would remain airborne at all times, staffed by a general officer with the authority to execute the single integrated operational plan. The plane carried launch codes, authentication protocols, and direct links to missile silos. If ground command was destroyed, the aircraft became the presidency. The first Looking Glass flight launched in 1961. For the next 29 years, there was always one in the air. Crews rotated every 8 hours. The aircraft refueled mid-flight. There was no pause. The system assumed that war would begin without warning, and that retaliation required automation. What made Looking Glass different from other command platforms was that it did not wait for orders. It was authorized to execute a nuclear strike independently if it determined that the chain of command had been severed. The determination was procedural. If communication with ground-based leadership could not be established within a specific time window, the assumption was that those leaders no longer existed. The general on board did not need confirmation. He needed absence. For nearly 3 decades, someone in the sky had the authority to end the world based on silence. The Soviet Union developed a parallel system, though it functioned in reverse. Perimeter, known in the West as Dead Hand, was an automated retaliation network designed to launch a full nuclear response, even if every human operator was dead. It was not a backup. It was a guarantee. Perimeter consisted of command rockets positioned across Soviet territory. If seismic sensors detected nuclear detonations on Soviet soil, if communication lines to leadership went dark, and if no override signal was received within a predetermined window, the system assumed decapitation. The command rockets would launch automatically, flying over Soviet missile fields and transmitting launch orders to silos. The silos would open and fire without human input. The system was tested in the early 1980s. It was placed on high alert during the Able Archer exercises in 1983, when Soviet leadership believed NATO was preparing a real first strike disguised as a drill. Perimeter was never deactivated in the way Looking Glass was. In 1993, Russian officials confirmed the system was still operational. In 2009, they confirmed it again. Whether it remains active is not publicly disclosed. What is known is that the infrastructure still exists, and that reactivation would not require new construction. It would require a policy decision made in a context where the United States and Russia are no longer formal adversaries, but are also not transparent about strategic capabilities. The system was built to function when no one was alive to turn it off. That remains true. In 1961, the United States Navy began construction of TACAMO, an acronym for Take Charge and Move Out. It was a fleet of aircraft designed to communicate with submerged ballistic missile submarines. Submarines were the most secure leg of the nuclear triad because they were undetectable and mobile. They were also unreachable by conventional radio. Takamo aircraft trailed miles-long antennas and transmitted emergency action messages on extremely low frequencies that could penetrate seawater. The messages were brief and coded. They did not contain strategy. They contained execution instructions. If a submarine received a valid emergency action message and could not establish two-way communication to verify the order, the standing protocol was to assume command authority had been destroyed and to act on the message. Submarine commanders were given pre-authorized target packages. They did not need updated intelligence. They did not need confirmation of enemy action. They needed a valid code sequence. Takamo ensured that even if the continental United States was a crater, submarines would receive their orders. The system is still operational. The aircraft have been upgraded, but the mission profile has not changed. There are always planes in the air, always transmitting. The submarines do not surface to verify. They listen. In 1962, the Soviet Union placed nuclear warheads on submarines stationed near Cuba. The deployment was a response to American Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. The submarines were diesel-electric, which meant they had to surface periodically to recharge batteries. Each carried a single nuclear-tipped torpedo. The authorization to use the torpedo required consent from 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. On October 27th, during the naval blockade, the submarine B-59 was tracked by American destroyers. The destroyers did not know the submarine carried a nuclear weapon. They deployed practice depth charges to force it to surface. Inside the submarine, conditions were catastrophic. The ventilation system had failed. The temperature exceeded 120 degrees. Carbon dioxide levels were near fatal. Crew members were collapsing. The captain believed war had begun. He ordered the nuclear torpedo armed. The political officer agreed. The executive officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. Soviet protocol required unanimity. The torpedo was not fired. The submarine surfaced and returned to the Soviet fleet. The United States did not learn the submarine had been nuclear-armed until decades later. There was no communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev about the incident, because neither knew how close the decision had been. Arkhipov did not refuse on moral grounds. He refused because protocol had not been fully satisfied. He believed communication with Moscow was still possible. The margin between nuclear war and its prevention was one man's interpretation of procedure. He died in 1998. No award was given. No record of his decision was made public during the Cold War. In 1969, the United States activated an automated early warning system called BMEWS, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. It consisted of radar installations in Alaska, Greenland, and the United Kingdom. The radars could detect launches from Soviet territory and calculate trajectory, speed, and estimated impact. If an inbound launch was detected, the system transmitted an alert to NORAD. NORAD had minutes to assess the threat and brief the president. In 1971, BMEWs detected a large-scale missile launch from Siberia. The trajectory indicated strikes on the continental United States. Duty officers initiated emergency protocols. The alert reached the Pentagon. Bomber crews were scrambled. ICBMs were placed on alert status. The president was not immediately notified because verification was ongoing. Within 3 minutes, a technician identified the source of the radar return. It was the rising moon. The radar had misinterpreted its reflection over the Ural Mountains. The alert was cancelled. The incident was classified. It was not disclosed until a congressional hearing in 1980. The system was not redesigned. The risk was considered acceptable because verification procedures were eventually effective. The assumption was that errors would always be caught in time. That assumption was tested repeatedly. In 1979, NORAD received a computer-generated alert indicating a full-scale Soviet nuclear launch. The alert was specific. It identified the number of missiles, their trajectories, and their targets. Duty officers followed protocol. They contacted the Pentagon. The president's military aide was notified. Strategic bombers were ordered to prepare for takeoff. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were moved to launch-ready status. The entire process took 4 minutes. Before the president was briefed, a technician realized the alert was generated by a training tape that had been mistakenly loaded into the operational system. The tape simulated a Soviet first strike. It was used for drills. Someone had inserted it into the live computer. The alert was cancelled. The bombers returned to standby. The incident was classified. It was disclosed in 1980 during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. The error was attributed to human mistake. The system was not restructured. In 1980, the same system generated another false alert. This time, a failing microchip caused the computer to randomly generate attack warnings. The chip cost 46 cents. It created 3 separate alerts over a 3-day period. Each alert was investigated and dismissed, but only after initial preparations for retaliation had begun. The defective chip was replaced. No redesign of the alert protocol was implemented. In 1983, NATO conducted a command post exercise called Able Archer. It was a routine simulation of escalation procedures leading to nuclear release. The scenario involved a transition from conventional war to nuclear use in stages. It was scheduled in advance and announced to the Warsaw Pact. What NATO did not anticipate was how it would be interpreted. The exercise coincided with several unrelated events that Soviet intelligence assessed as preparations for war. The United States had recently deployed Pershing II missiles in West Germany. The missiles could reach Moscow in under 10 minutes. The Reagan administration had escalated rhetoric significantly. In March 1983, Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. In September, Soviet air defense shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 people on board, including a U.S. congressman. The Soviet leadership believed the flight had been a reconnaissance mission. Tensions were severe. When Able Archer began, Soviet intelligence reported that NATO was using the exercise as cover for an actual first strike. The Warsaw Pact was placed on high alert. Soviet nuclear forces were readied. Bomber crews were moved to their aircraft. The KGB sent urgent cables to residencies in Western Europe, ordering them to report any signs of imminent attack. The Soviet leadership waited for confirmation that NATO was transitioning from exercise to execution. That confirmation never came because the exercise ended as scheduled. Soviet forces stood down. The United States did not learn how close the situation had been until after the Cold War. The British intelligence service, through a source inside Soviet intelligence, informed the United States that Soviet leadership had genuinely believed war was imminent. Reagan was reportedly shaken. He had not intended to provoke that reaction. The exercise was a drill. The interpretation was not. In 1966, a B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with a refueling tanker over Spain. The bomber broke apart. The bombs fell. 3 were recovered near the village of Palomares. The high explosive in 2 of them detonated on impact, spreading plutonium across the countryside. The 3rd was recovered intact. The 4th fell into the Mediterranean Sea. It was located after a 2-month search and recovered by a submersible. The United States and Spain conducted a joint cleanup. Contaminated soil was excavated and shipped to the United States. The incident was reported in the press, but the details were minimized. What was not disclosed was how frequently similar incidents occurred. Between 1950 and 1980, there were 32 documented broken arrow incidents involving U.S. nuclear weapons. A broken arrow is a military term for an accident involving nuclear weapons that does not create the risk of nuclear war. It includes crashes, fires, jettisoned weapons, and lost devices. In 1968, another B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed in Greenland. The bombs ruptured. Plutonium contaminated the ice sheet. Cleanup efforts recovered most of the material, but one bomb's secondary stage was never found. It remains under the ice. In 1961, a B-52 broke apart over North Carolina. 2 hydrogen bombs fell. Each had a yield of 4 megatons. One bomb's parachute deployed. It landed intact. The other hit the ground at high speed. 5 of its 6 safety mechanisms failed. A single switch prevented detonation. The bomb was buried deep in a swamp. Part of it was never recovered. The Air Force concluded that it posed no risk. The site was purchased by the government and is monitored. In 1977, the Soviet Union began deployment of the SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missile. It was mobile, accurate, and capable of carrying multiple warheads. It was positioned in Eastern Europe and Western Russia, targeting NATO capitals. NATO had no equivalent system. The imbalance created pressure to respond. In 1979, NATO approved the dual-track decision. It committed to deploying American Pershing II missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe, while simultaneously pursuing arms control negotiations. The missiles were deployed in 1983. The Pershing II could strike Moscow in less than 10 minutes from launch. Soviet leadership viewed this as a decapitation capability. It reduced the warning time to a point where a decision to launch on warning became operationally necessary. Launch on warning means firing nuclear weapons based on radar detection of an inbound strike before the warheads detonate. It compresses decision-making to minutes. It removes the possibility of verification. The Soviet Union did not publicly declare a launch on warning policy, but operational behavior suggested it was implemented. The United States maintained a policy of retaliatory strike, meaning it would absorb a first strike and then respond. However, the command and control systems developed during this period were optimized for rapid decision-making, which implied readiness to launch on warning, even if policy stated otherwise. In 1980, the Damascus Titan II missile explosion occurred at a silo in Arkansas. A maintenance technician dropped a socket wrench. It punctured the missile's fuel tank. Kerosene 50 fuel began leaking. The fuel is hypergolic, meaning it ignites on contact with its oxidizer. The missile carried a W-53 warhead with a yield of 9 megatons. Evacuation orders were given. The Air Force attempted to stabilize the missile remotely. 8 hours after the puncture, the missile exploded. The warhead was ejected from the silo and landed in a ditch. It did not detonate. The explosion killed 1 technician and injured 21 others. The Air Force concluded that the warhead's safety mechanisms functioned correctly. The incident raised questions about the stability of liquid-fueled missiles and the risks of maintaining them on high alert. Titan II missiles were eventually decommissioned, but not immediately. They remained operational for several more years. The silo in Damascus was sealed. The site is now a museum. In 1985, the United States initiated the Strategic Defense Initiative, announced by Reagan in 1983. The program aimed to develop a space-based missile defense system capable of intercepting Soviet ICBMs during their boost phase. The concept required satellites equipped with directed energy weapons or kinetic interceptors. The technical challenges were immense. The system needed to track thousands of targets simultaneously, discriminate between warheads and decoys, and destroy them before they re-entered the atmosphere. The Soviet Union viewed the initiative as destabilizing because it undermined the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. If the United States could defend against a Soviet strike, it could launch a first strike without fear of retaliation. The Soviet Union threatened to deploy countermeasures, including additional ICBMs and decoys. Arms control negotiations stalled. The initiative never became operational. Components were tested, but the integrated system was not completed. Research continued in various forms under different names. The current U.S. missile defense system is a descendant of that research, though it is designed to counter limited strikes from smaller adversaries, not a large-scale Russian launch. Whether it would be effective is debated. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, the Soviet Union placed its airborne divisions on alert and prepared to deploy them to Egypt. The United States responded by raising its military alert status to DEFCON 3, the highest level during the Cold War outside of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The alert was initiated without informing U.S. allies in NATO. Nuclear-capable bombers were dispersed. Attack submarines were positioned. The alert lasted for several days. The Soviet Union did not deploy its forces. The crisis de-escalated. The alert was downgraded. What remained classified for years was that the decision to escalate to DEFCON 3 was made while President Nixon was dealing with the Watergate crisis. His chief of staff and national security advisor, without fully briefing Nixon, made strategic decisions about nuclear posture. The command structure functioned, but the assumption that the president was fully in control was not accurate. The system was designed to operate through procedure, and it did. Whether that was appropriate is a separate question. In 1967, the USS Liberty, a signals intelligence ship, was attacked by Israeli forces during the Six-Day War. The ship was in international waters off the coast of Egypt. Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats struck the ship repeatedly. 34 crew members were killed. Over 170 were wounded. The ship was nearly sunk. Israel claimed the attack was a case of mistaken identity. The United States accepted the explanation. What was not disclosed for decades was that the Liberty had intercepted communications indicating that Israeli forces knew the ship was American. Survivors reported that the attack lasted over an hour and that the ship was clearly marked. The United States did not retaliate. The incident was downplayed to avoid straining the U.S.-Israel relationship. The Cold War context mattered. The Soviet Union was backing Arab states. Israel was a strategic ally. A public dispute would have complicated the broader geopolitical situation. The crew was ordered not to discuss the incident. Some have argued that the attack was intentional, meant to prevent the United States from intercepting communications about Israeli military plans. The official position has not changed. In 1974, India conducted its first nuclear test, codenamed Smiling Buddha. The device was detonated underground in the Rajasthan desert. India described it as a peaceful nuclear explosion, intended for civilian purposes. The test used plutonium produced in a research reactor supplied by Canada under a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement. The agreement prohibited military use. India argued that the test was not a weapon. The distinction was not accepted internationally. Canada suspended nuclear cooperation. The test demonstrated that civilian nuclear programs could be converted to weapons development. It also revealed gaps in the Non-Proliferation Treaty framework. Pakistan responded by accelerating its own nuclear program. By the early 1980s, Pakistan had developed the capability to produce weapons-grade uranium. Both nations maintained ambiguity about their arsenals. Neither joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In 1998, both conducted overt nuclear tests. The Cold War superpowers had not prevented proliferation. They had modeled it. In 1964, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to install a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow. It was called the Hotline. The agreement followed the Cuban Missile Crisis, during which delays in communication had increased the risk of miscalculation. The hotline was not a telephone. It was a teletype link that transmitted written messages. Later, it was upgraded to a satellite communication system. The purpose was to allow leaders to communicate directly during a crisis without relying on diplomatic channels or public statements. The hotline was used several times, including during the Six-Day War, the Indo-Pakistani War, the Yom Kippur War, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was not used to prevent crises. It was used to manage them after they had begun. The existence of the hotline did not eliminate miscommunication. It reduced the delay. Whether that made crises less dangerous is unclear. It allowed leaders to exchange positions quickly, but it did not resolve the underlying conflicts. The hotline is still operational. In 1979, a Titan II missile in Kansas experienced a fuel leak similar to the Damascus incident. The leak was contained. The warhead was removed. The missile was deactivated. The incident was not widely reported. In 1980, a fire broke out at a missile silo in South Dakota. The crew evacuated. The missile did not explode. The warhead was secured. These incidents were not anomalies. Liquid-fueled missiles required constant maintenance. They were aging. Safety protocols were rigorous, but the systems were inherently unstable. Solid-fueled missiles were more reliable, but the transition was slow. Throughout the 1980s, the United States maintained hundreds of missiles that required technicians to work inside silos filled with volatile fuel. Accidents were expected. The question was whether the safety mechanisms would function. They usually did. In 1952, the United States detonated Ivy Mike, the first thermonuclear device. It was not a deployable weapon. It was an experiment. The device weighed over 80 tons and required a building-sized cryogenic system to keep the fusion fuel liquid. It vaporized an island in the Pacific. The yield was 10 megatons, hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The test proved that fusion weapons were feasible. The Soviet Union detonated its first thermonuclear device in 1953. It was smaller and used a different design, but it confirmed that the Soviets had mastered the physics. By the late 1950s, both nations had deployable thermonuclear warheads. The yields increased. In 1961, the Soviet Union tested Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated. The yield was 50 megatons. The fireball was visible from 600 miles away. The shockwave circled the Earth 3 times. The test was a demonstration. The weapon was too large to be practical. The point was to show capability. After Tsar Bomba, both nations focused on accuracy and delivery systems rather than raw yield. The logic shifted. A war would not be won by destroying the most territory. It would be won by destroying the enemy's ability to retaliate. That required hitting missile silos, command centers, and submarine bases. Precision mattered more than megatonnage. The weapons became smaller and more numerous. In 1972, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. It restricted the deployment of missile defense systems. Each side was allowed 2 sites. Later, the treaty was amended to allow only 1 site per country. The United States chose to defend its ICBM fields in North Dakota. The Soviet Union chose to defend Moscow. The treaty was based on the logic of mutually assured destruction. If both sides were vulnerable, neither would attack. If one side could defend itself, it might risk a first strike. The treaty stabilized the arms race in certain ways. It did not stop the development of offensive weapons. Both nations continued to build more missiles, more warheads, and more accurate delivery systems. The treaty was observed for decades. In 2002, the United States withdrew from the treaty to pursue missile defense against emerging threats. Russia responded by developing new weapons designed to evade missile defenses. The strategic balance shifted again. In 1986, the Reykjavik summit between Reagan and Gorbachev nearly resulted in an agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons. The proposal came from Gorbachev. Reagan was receptive. The 2 leaders discussed abolishing ballistic missiles entirely within 10 years. The talks collapsed over the Strategic Defense Initiative. Gorbachev insisted that research be confined to laboratories. Reagan refused. The summit ended without an agreement. What is often overlooked is how close the discussion came to fundamentally altering the nuclear order. Both leaders, for different reasons, were willing to consider abolition. The obstacle was not the weapons themselves, but the systems designed to defend against them. The summit demonstrated that the arms race was driven as much by fear of vulnerability as by aggression. Neither side trusted the other to remain defenseless. The weapons remained. In 1987, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed. It eliminated an entire class of missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. It was the first treaty to reduce nuclear arsenals rather than merely limit their growth. The treaty required on-site inspections. Both sides destroyed thousands of missiles. The SS-20, the Pershing II, and ground-launched cruise missiles were dismantled. The treaty was seen as a breakthrough. It remained in force for over 30 years. In 2019, the United States withdrew, citing Russian violations. Russia denied the violations and subsequently withdrew as well. The treaty is no longer in effect. The missiles it banned are being developed again. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War was declared over. The nuclear arsenals did not disappear. Russia inherited the Soviet stockpile. Ukraine Kazakhstan and Belarus temporarily held nuclear weapons but returned them to Russia under international agreements. The United States and Russia signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which reduced deployed strategic warheads. The reductions were significant but gradual. Thousands of warheads remained. Many were placed in reserve or dismantled slowly. The infrastructure built to deliver them was maintained. Submarines continued patrols. Bombers remained on alert. Missile silos were kept operational. The command and control systems were updated, but not fundamentally changed. The assumption that the Cold War's end meant the end of its weapons was incorrect. The systems designed to survive after humanity continued to function. They were designed to outlast the governments that built them. They have.